The story begins with a rising tension inside a quiet suburban neighborhood where the HOA had always been known for its stern policies and rigid control. For years, homeowners whispered about unfair warnings, sudden fines, and suspicious board decisions that never seemed to follow the rules written in the official handbook. Yet most residents complied, believing resistance would only make things worse. Into this environment lived the narrator, someone who valued peace, privacy, and a sense of control over their own home. Things had been uneventful for a long time, until one morning when a letter arrived that would disrupt everything. The envelope looked official, stamped with the HOA crest, and carried an urgent tone that immediately triggered anxiety. Inside was a notice of violation stating that the narrator had committed multiple infractions: improper maintenance of the property, unauthorized external modifications, and repeated non-compliance with community standards. None of these claims were true. The garden was trimmed, the paint was original, and the narrator had never been warned of any issue prior to this letter. Yet at the bottom of the page, there was a sentence that froze the narrator in disbelief: the HOA intended to begin eviction proceedings if the violations were not corrected within 10 days. Shock turned into confusion, which slowly shifted into frustration. Eviction? Over non-existent violations? Something was clearly wrong. The narrator began retracing every detail from the past few months, searching for any misunderstanding or overlooked issue that could justify this sudden attack. Nothing made sense. The property had passed routine inspections. Neighbors had complimented the upkeep. There had been no disputes or conflicts that could have escalated into retaliation. The letter felt baseless, almost personal, as if someone wanted the narrator gone. As hours passed, the narrator's concern grew into determination. Instead of panicking, they decided to investigate the situation thoroughly. The first step was reviewing the HOA bylaws. The official document was thicker than expected, full of legal jargon and clauses that seemed intentionally complicated. But with patience, patterns began to emerge: specific procedures for issuing violations, mandatory warnings, proper channels for disputes, and strict rules the HOA itself was required to follow before escalating any action. And the narrator immediately noticed something alarming: none of the steps described in the bylaws matched the process outlined in the letter they had received. According to the bylaws, an HOA could not issue an eviction threat without at least 3 written notices, each requiring clear evidence and opportunity for correction. But the narrator hadn't received even a single prior warning. The more pages they read, the more suspicious the situation felt. It was almost as if the HOA was bypassing its own rules, hoping the homeowner wouldn't notice. Still, the narrator needed more clues. They walked the neighborhood, observing small things that had once seemed ordinary but now appeared suspicious. Selective enforcement was everywhere. One house had an unapproved shed, another had overgrown hedges, and many had modifications that technically violated the rules. Yet none of those homes had been targeted. Why only this house? Why now? The turning point came when the narrator decided to reach out quietly to a few neighbors. Although the story had to be told carefully to avoid spreading panic, the neighbors' responses revealed a new layer of the puzzle. Some had experienced unfair fines. Others had received sudden violation letters that didn't match reality. And a few mentioned something far more concerning: a group within the HOA board had been rumored to target homeowners whose properties they believed could be resold at higher values once the owners were pushed out. It was a subtle yet alarming pattern. Evictions might not be about rule enforcement at all. They might be about control and profit. With this growing suspicion, the narrator dug deeper into the HOA's meeting minutes, archived newsletters, and financial disclosures. Hidden among generic announcements and maintenance updates was a line item that raised a red flag: a substantial increase in budget allocation for legal recovery and property repossession initiatives. The description was vague, strategic, and intentionally ambiguous. But paired with everything else discovered, it painted a clear picture. The HOA had a history of attempting to seize properties under questionable circumstances. All this information strengthened the narrator's resolve to fight back. But the real breakthrough, the moment that changed everything, arrived late at night. While reviewing the bylaws one last time, the narrator discovered a rarely referenced section, a clause that described mandatory documentation requirements the HOA must provide for any threat of eviction. Failure to provide these documents rendered the eviction invalid and exposed the HOA to penalties. And crucially, the letter the narrator received did not comply with any of these requirements. That was the rule that could destroy their entire case. It was obscure, overlooked, and powerful. The narrator realized that not only was the eviction attempt illegitimate, but it could legally backfire on the HOA. This new knowledge brought a surge of confidence, but the narrator knew this was just the beginning. The HOA would not go down without a fight, and exposing the truth would require careful planning and undeniable evidence. As the chapter ends, the narrator prepares to take the first official step in challenging the HOA, ready to reveal the rule that could dismantle their scheme, but aware that doing so might provoke the board into more aggressive actions. The days following the discovery of the hidden clause unfolded with a tense mixture of anticipation and caution. The narrator knew the HOA was expecting compliance, fear, or silence, anything except resistance. Yet the moment the letter arrived, something had shifted. The narrator was no longer a passive homeowner caught in the crossfire of unfair enforcement. They had become someone armed with knowledge the HOA never intended them to find. The first strategic move was drafting an official response letter. It had to be firm, precise, and entirely based on the HOA's own bylaws. The narrator reviewed the words repeatedly, ensuring every sentence aligned with documented procedures and legal expectations. The goal wasn't confrontation for the sake of conflict, it was exposing the inconsistencies in the HOA's actions and forcing them to comply with the very rules they had ignored. Once satisfied, the letter was sent, demanding evidence, proper notices, and all required documents as outlined in the obscure clause discovered in the bylaws. But the narrator didn't expect what came next. The HOA board reacted with silence. No acknowledgement, no reply, no attempt to address the questions raised. That silence, however, created an entirely different form of confirmation. It meant the board wasn't just disorganized, they were hiding something. The narrator suspected they had never expected anyone to question the legitimacy of their actions. The lack of response revealed a board that relied on fear rather than protocol, intimidation rather than fairness. Still, silence wasn't enough to win the fight. Proof was necessary. So the narrator began gathering every piece of evidence possible. Pictures of the property were taken from multiple angles. Copies of previous inspections were pulled from archives. Neighbors provided statements confirming the home had always been well maintained. Every detail mattered, because the HOA's accusations weren't just false, they were fabricated. As this evidence compiled, the narrator also dug deeper into the HOA's internal behavior. Meeting minutes showed unusual patterns. Decisions regarding violations were often made privately, without homeowner attendance. Fines were frequently inconsistent and lacked documentation. And some board members seemed to have personal connections with local real estate agents who specialized in distressed property acquisitions. The pieces were aligning in a way that revealed a troubling picture. The HOA was strategically targeting homes that held strong resale value. With every discovery, the narrator felt the weight of the situation growing heavier. This was no longer just about one attempted eviction, it was about a systematic pattern of control and exploitation. And if the narrator didn't push back now, others would likely face the same fate. Finally, after days of silence, the HOA sent a response, but it was not what anyone would expect from an official board. The letter was defensive, vague, and avoided addressing the exact clauses the narrator had referenced. It made generalized claims about community standards and compliance expectations, but failed to include any evidence or documentation. The HOA insisted the violation stood and demanded immediate correction. The refusal to acknowledge the bylaws was the confirmation the narrator needed. Instead of backing down, the narrator pushed forward. A formal request for a hearing was submitted, forcing the HOA to meet face-to-face. According to the bylaws, the board must allow homeowners to present their case, and failing to honor that process would place them in immediate violation of their own operational mandates. This request trapped them, ignoring it would be illegal, but granting it would expose their misconduct. The meeting day approached with a sense of escalating tension. The narrator prepared meticulously, organizing every document, photo, and bylaw citation. Meanwhile, the neighborhood buzzed quietly with rumors. Some homeowners, fed up with the HOA's heavy-handed tactics, offered support. Others watched silently, fearful that involvement might provoke retaliation. Yet the underlying energy in the community was shifting. People sensed a confrontation coming, one that could determine the future of the neighborhood. On the evening of the hearing, the narrator arrived early. The room was small, stiff, and carried an atmosphere of artificial authority. The board members sat behind a long table, their expressions a mixture of discomfort and restrained irritation. They had not expected resistance, and their unease was obvious. The hearing began with the board reading the alleged violations aloud, though they did so without showing any documented proof. Their tone was confident, but their presentation was hollow. When it was the narrator's turn to speak, the mood changed. Detailed evidence was placed on the table. Photos, inspection records, neighbor statements, and printed pages of the bylaw clause the HOA had violated. Each point dismantled the accusations piece by piece. The board grew tense. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others exchanged glances that revealed more than their words ever could. They attempted to divert the conversation, focusing on subjective interpretations of the rules, but the narrator stayed firm. The bylaws were clear, the process was mandatory, and the HOA had bypassed every step. The final blow came when the narrator read the obscure clause aloud, the rule requiring the HOA to provide specific documentation before issuing any eviction threat. The rule they ignored. The rule that invalidated their entire case. The board had no response. The room fell silent, and the weight of truth settled heavily over everyone present. Even the board members who normally defended every decision with unwavering confidence couldn't deny the evidence. Their actions were not only illegitimate but potentially actionable. Sensing their position crumbling, the HOA abruptly ended the meeting, claiming they needed time to review the materials. But the narrator knew what this meant. The board had been cornered. Their strategy had failed. And now, they were scrambling to salvage their authority. But the fight wasn't over yet. The narrator left the meeting knowing that exposing the truth had only begun a larger battle, one that would reveal just how far the HOA was willing to go to protect its power. The days after the hearing stretched into a quiet but heavy silence across the neighborhood. The HOA board, usually loud with announcements, fines, and reminders, suddenly became inactive. No new letters were sent. No meetings were scheduled. No patrols circulated the streets with clipboards in hand. It was as if the entire organization had stepped back into the shadows, hoping to regain control before anyone noticed the cracks in their authority. But the silence itself was revealing. The narrator continued documenting everything, knowing that the next move would be crucial. The evidence collected was organized into a clear, chronological record, every violation of the bylaws, every missing document, every attempt at intimidation, and every suspicious financial entry buried in the HOA's public reports. The more the narrator reviewed the information, the more obvious the pattern became. This was not an isolated case. It was a system of manipulation built on the assumption that no one would challenge them. Yet now someone had. In the week following the hearing, something unexpected began happening. Neighbors started reaching out on their own. Some knocked quietly on the door, while others slipped notes into the mailbox. Their stories were unsettlingly similar: unexplained fines, sudden violations, denied appeal requests, and decisions made without transparency. These were people who had remained silent for years, believing that speaking up would only worsen their situation. But after seeing someone stand up to the board and survive the first wave of retaliation, they found a new sense of courage. Their voices added weight to the narrator's growing case. Every story, every supporting detail, and every pattern of misconduct reinforced the truth: the HOA's leadership had been abusing their authority for a long time. And the narrator realized that fighting alone was no longer necessary. The community was slowly waking up. Then, just when the narrator expected some response from the HOA, a new letter appeared, noticeably different from the others. Instead of a violation or threat, it was an invitation to a special emergency meeting open to all homeowners. The vague language and sudden transparency were suspicious, but unavoidable. It was clear the board had been forced into a corner and was now trying to regain control with a public display of authority. The meeting was held in the community hall, a place that had rarely been filled to capacity. But on this evening, nearly every homeowner came. Chairs ran out. People lined the walls. The atmosphere buzzed with tension, curiosity, and a quiet sense of unity that had never existed before. The board entered the room with stiff posture and forced smiles, clearly trying to appear confident. But beneath the surface, their energy was different, uneasy, defensive, and strained. They opened the meeting with a rehearsed speech about recent misunderstandings and confusion regarding procedural steps. They tried to frame the narrator's situation as a simple internal mistake, a minor oversight that had been blown out of proportion. But the room didn't believe them. Homeowners had come with their own questions, their own experiences, and their own frustrations. The board attempted to maintain control, but the more they spoke, the more the narrator realized they were avoiding the one thing they could not defend, the rule they had broken. Eventually, the narrator stood and addressed the room. Rather than focusing on emotions or personal frustration, they presented the facts as clearly as possible. The missing notices. The absence of documents. The illegal escalation of violations. The hidden budget for property repossessions. The obscure clause in the bylaws that invalidated the eviction attempt entirely. As the narrator spoke, murmurs spread across the room. Homeowners exchanged looks of disbelief, anger, and recognition. Many had suspected corruption, but seeing the evidence laid out so plainly shifted the entire dynamic of the meeting. The HOA board members, once feared and unquestioned, looked smaller under the weight of their exposed failures. When the narrator finished, the room erupted, not in chaos, but in applause. It was the first time in years that the community had come together with a shared voice. The board tried to regain control, but the homeowners no longer had patience for evasive explanations. They demanded accountability. They demanded reform. Some even demanded resignation. Cornered and overwhelmed, the board members fell back into a defensive silence. They could no longer deny the truth. Their authority had been built on secrecy and intimidation, and the narrator had now torn open the foundation. Every homeowner in the room had witnessed the proof. There was no going back. Within a week, the consequences unfolded swiftly. 3 board members resigned, citing personal reasons. A temporary oversight committee was formed, made up of neutral homeowners who reviewed every violation issued in the past year. Most of them were overturned. The budget was audited, revealing even more inconsistencies that required formal investigation. And the eviction attempt against the narrator was not only dismissed but officially recorded as illegitimate. The narrator's case changed the community forever. For the first time, homeowners felt a sense of empowerment. Meetings became transparent. Decisions required documented justification. Inspections had to follow proper procedure. The HOA was no longer a ruling force, it was a system held accountable by the people it was supposed to serve. As the story closes, the narrator looks back at how everything began. A single unjust letter had nearly forced them out of their home. But instead of surrendering, they uncovered the rule that dismantled the HOA's entire scheme. The journey was exhausting, intimidating, and full of uncertainty, but it ended with a community stronger than ever and a system forced to operate with fairness. The narrator kept their home. And the HOA, once feared, learned that power only lasts as long as people stay silent.